Welcome to the Chaos and Light podcast. I am your host, Angela Levesque, and on today's episode, I'm speaking with Scott Shay on a rational belief in God. And we'll look at some of the big questions that I know that I had myself when I was growing up, that we had around faith and God and religion, and we'll look at them thoughtfully and rationally. Chaos and Light is part of the Chaos and Light community, which is an online space for spiritual seekers to connect, inspire, and expand with other like-minded people. If you haven't checked it out, go to chaosandlight.com for more information. There's new upcoming events, guided meditations, new articles almost every week. So please go to chaosandlight.com. When we return, we will be speaking with Scott Shay. Do you need more spiritual sustenance in your daily life? Check out chaosandlight.com, where new articles, blogs, meditations are added weekly. Chaosandlight.com, a playground for mind, mystery, and human potential. Well, I'm here today with Scott A. Shay, and he is the author of In Good Faith, Questioning Religion and Atheism and Getting Our Groove Back, How to Energize American Jewry. He also has an upcoming book, or I think it might already be out, Conspiracy U, a case study, which exposes how conspiracy theories drawn from the far right and far left ideologies masquerade as scholarship at many universities. He has also written articles on Judaism, belief, and the economy for many leading publications. Scott is a passionate community activist and has been thinking about religion, reason, and modernity since wondering why his parents sent him to Hebrew school. So with that, welcome, Scott, to the Chaos and Light podcast.
Angela, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's
Thank
a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Well, when I saw this come across my email, I thought, I would love this conversation. And I've actually reached out. This would be kind of the flip side of the coin. I've actually reached out to atheists wanting to talk to them because I think it's a really interesting it's an interesting space to occupy, to be able to understand how different people find meaning in their life, whether that's through God or whether that's through, ethics or philosophy. And I know that there's going to be places where you and I agree, but there's probably some places where we don't agree. And actually, I have some similar criticisms with atheism that you probably have with me. So we'll get into that. But let's start a little bit, share with my listeners your background.
So I grew up in Chicago, and I grew up the son of a Holocaust survivor. So my father, when he was not quite 14, the Nazis came into his town in Svexno, Lithuania, and they murdered his father. They murdered his aunts, his uncles, most of his cousins. In the end, all of his cousins died. My closest relative is a second cousin once removed on my father's side of the family. And he was deported as slave labor to the Svetlin Heidekrug work camp. And then he was sent elsewhere. And then he ended up in Auschwitz. And then, which he was in Auschwitz for just 3 months because he was, quote unquote, lucky to be sent to a work detail. And so he didn't spend a huge amount of time. He spent just these 3 months in Auschwitz. And then he was, at the end of the war, liberated from Dachau by the American forces. So and when he was liberated, by the way, my father was less than 70 pounds. It took him a year to get nursed back to health. In an American field hospital. He was always grateful to just the United States of America for healing this person, probably days, months away from, not months, probably days, at most weeks away from death, back to health. So when my father ended up in Chicago, got married, had me as a child, I'm an only child, my father didn't have faith in God. Actually, in a certain kind of way, he had certainty that there was a God, because if he was one step forward, one step behind, one step to the side, either side, he would have been killed. He would have been murdered. He would have been put on a work detail that would have been certain death. If any tiny thing would have happened, if you would have been wearing your microphone on the right instead of the left. I mean, such tiny things meant the difference between his being alive and his not being alive. So when he got to the United States, to Chicago, he had a sort of certainty of God. On the same token, he had anger at God, because if God could save him through all of these tiny little hidden miracles, then what about the rest of his family, his father, who was practically murdered in front of him, and his brothers? And it just, it was very hard. So it was very interesting when my father went to synagogue and took me to synagogue. I noticed something that took me decades to figure out. He would, during the services, he talked to the person the row ahead, he talked to people nearby. And then when the rabbi gave his sermon, he was always very polite. He wouldn't talk to anybody, he'd just doze off. And then at the end of services, he'd go to what we call a kiddush or a collation, and he would enjoy the social aspects. But he was not talking to God at services. And it took me a long time to realize that my father was giving God the silent treatment. Like, I know you're there, but no, I'm not going to talk to you. But it's important to my son being bar mitzvah, it's important that there be a Jewish community. This is all very important, but I'm not talking to you, God. And so I grew up with that. So I grew up with these questions of how could there be such good and good? How could there be such evil in the world if we believe in an all good God? And these were tough questions. And they ended up being questions that sort of I grappled with my entire life, and in a way culminated with this book.
Well, let's start there. I know that that's, I think, part 3 in your book, but since you brought it up, because that was a question that I had as well growing up. So I grew up in a very strong Baptist family, and I had a lot of questions. And one of them was, if there is this a loving God, how could he allow such evil in this world? So what is your response to people who pose that question?
Well, first of all, I think, as you noted, my book has 6 parts, and I deal with, I think, the major questions that the atheists bring. And the hardest question that I found is the question of exactly that. I mean, I think actually the other questions for believers are much easier. Science, the historicity of the Bible, prayer, they're actually easier to grapple with than how can God allow what goes on in the world? 500,000 people in the United States and 600,000 people in the United States dying from COVID. How do these things happen? And I'm going to also tie this into your introduction, which is, so one of the great things about doing book tour before COVID, I started doing book tour before COVID, and then it became obviously Zoom book tour. But I did a Google talk, which is obviously posted. And my guess is 80% of the people there were atheists at my Google talk. The sort of standard high-techy group. No, I don't mean that as any disparagement. I mean, sort of what you would gather. And that was the question that they came coming both before and to some degree on the talk, but before and after, that was the question that they kept coming to. And they would all ask I remember one person asked this question, well, we have reason. Why do we need God? That'll make us good. And I tried to explain, and I think I made a dent in explaining that reason alone is not sufficient to be good. I mean, the Nazis thought they were being scientific and reasonable. Kant, one person asked me at Google about Kant. Well, the moral imperative. Kant was an incredible racist. I mean, he did some good things, and was very interesting, but huge racist. Thought that people of other races were inferior and not totally human. And again, reason leads us to some very bad places. Peter Singer, who you probably heard of, he's the leading atheist moral philosopher alive today. And he believes, just like Richard Dawkins, in infanticide. Because if a baby is born with disabilities and it's going to cost society a lot and it's going to be harmful to the parents, uh, rather than spend millions of dollars over the course of the lifetime on this disabled the infant should be killed, and that money can be used for college education, etc. When I was doing my book, I met a medical director of a major U.S. company, a major U.S. insurance company, who said, if we just stop giving all but routine care to anyone younger than 30 days or older than 75, we could save enough money to send every young person to college for free. So why don't we do that? Was sort of the unstated question. Reason can get you to a whole bunch of bad places that, I don't necessarily want to let young babies die. I don't want to necessarily let old people say no cancer surgery for you. You're 75 in one day. And yet reason can lead you there very easily, which is why some people are disturbed by what Peter Singer says. And other people think, that's great, more power to him. We'd be a better society. So reason too is reason alone. And one of the things that is a major theme in my book, which you probably have gotten pretty quickly, is our big problem. And I think we can make common cause with atheists, believers and non-believers can make common cause with atheists, is avoiding idolatry of reason or idolatry of other things.
Well, I do definitely want to get into that. And I know that that is a really big part of your book. But I want to finish this this idea about questioning. Because this, for me, I growing up, when I was about 14, I had the loss of my grandfather. And that really started me on this path of asking all these questions. And I found that my questions were not well received, that there wasn't a lot of space for me to have doubt. So when I asked questions like, if there was a God, then, how could there be such atrocities? Or does that mean that all Buddhists are going to hell? Or all of those kind of things. A lot of times the answer was because it's in the Bible, And that to me wasn't good enough, that this was, okay, we have all these questions, we're not supposed to doubt. That's the point of faith, is that you have faith, that this is the kind of the guideline, the documents that we're working from, and there's not a lot of space for doubt. And for me, that was very difficult because I still had all these questions, and that idea that you should just have faith and it's in the Bible wasn't really cutting it for me. So it was then that I started branching out, and I started reading about Eastern philosophy and Buddhism and Taoism and meditation and all of that. And eventually when I got older, I wouldn't say that I've come back specifically to religion, but I have come back to God. And how do you think that having that doubt is a pretty, or at least allowing for doubt, is a pretty important part of having faith?
So first of all, I think without doubt, there is no faith. I really believe that, is that there isn't, my father was in a unique situation, but there's really no proof for God, and no proof, by the way, that there is no God. And I think at a certain basic level, whether we're an atheist or a believer, there's some faith involved, and we need to leave room for that faith. Not it's in the Bible and it says that, because actually the Bible again and again presents characters who question and who criticize and who argue with God. I mean, I'll give just a few examples. Jacob wrestles with God. That's what the name Yisrael means, wrestling, for you wrestled with God. Abraham, when Sodom and Gomorrah, are supposed to be. Um, Abraham receives a prophecy that they're going to be destroyed. He says, would the God of justice do such a thing if there were, but 50 men? Obviously brings it down to 5 people, 10 people. So right from the get-go, there's questioning. Moses questions God many times in the Bible. I mean, even though he's not. He ultimately does what God says, but he convinces God several times to literally change God's mind or to change what he's going to do. David, when he's bringing the ark to Jerusalem, people who get too close to it end up dying. And so he just puts the ark down and says, God, I'm not moving this ark anywhere until you get your act together. I mean, it says it in almost so many words. So I'm just giving you a few examples of again and again and again in the Bible, people question God. And the whole Talmud is about arguing and questioning. I mean, that's sort of a fundamental part of Judaism. Is there are majority opinions, there are minority opinions, but question, which is why it was so comfortable for me, honestly, to question both religion and atheism. And the truth of the matter is, I think that whether you are religious or a believer, a religious in an organized religion, or you're an atheist, I actually am okay with you as long as there's some parts of it that you're embarrassed about. Because that helps us get to questioning. We shouldn't be comfortable with our beliefs. We shouldn't be comfortable necessarily in organized religion because, and we can get to this later, but organized religion can become an idolatry in itself. And by the way, I found that atheists, while calling themselves atheists, easily slide into idolatry of some sort or another. It may be scientism, it may be communism, which is an atheist religion, but is clearly a religion with God kings. And so again and again, I think our real foe is idolatry. And I think the Bible and true monotheistic religion encourages one to grapple with texts and to question. I think it's idolatry that leads people to unquestioning. And I don't mean this as any criticism, well, I guess it is, of the people you spoke to when you were 14. But when people say don't question, that is the first sign something's wrong. Start questioning.
Yes. Okay. So let's jump into idolatry. And it's funny because my son asked me this week. He's like, "What's idolatry?" Out of the blue, and you have a slightly different, well, I wouldn't say different, but a far more in-depth and expanded view of what I was taught, which is basically false gods. Don't worship false gods. So I'm going to let you have the floor here and explain what you mean. And if you can give us, and this is in your book, you talk about some of the idolatry that happened in ancient times, as well as what idolatry looks like in modern times.
Okay. So thank you. Because this really gets to a certain degree the crux. I mean, there's a lot more in the book, but this is foundational to the book, which is if you stop people here on Fifth Avenue in New York and ask them what idolatry is, they're going to say, oh, it's either false gods, like you said, or it's bowing down to statues or Wiccan chants or something like that. But I think the stories of the Bible are clear. What idolatry is a set of lies about power. It's about ascribing super authority or superpower to finite beings, people like us, ideologies or natural processes. In the ancient world, also animals, but not so much anymore. So, and they were personified by a god king. like Pharaoh. So we may have thought that the God King Pharaoh was over in the Passover story. But in reality, the whole 20th century is a catalog of God King Pharaohs. The Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, the Assad family, the Kim family. It just goes on and on. I mean, Stalin. How did Stalin kill all of the kulaks, starve a quarter of the Ukraine, send tens of millions of people to the gulag, and many of them died, and nobody questioned him because he used the same tropes, the same exact tropes of the God King's Pharaoh: pageantry, poetry, theater, all of course backed up with secret informers and large armies and state violence. And he famously had his image projected into space, just like a God King Pharaoh would have done, just the same way a God King Pharaoh would have done. So that was the central tragedy of the 20th century, was essentially these idolatrous people, who are still at it, like Assad family and the Kim family. But it's not just the idolatry on a macro basis. It's also, what we miss is that even in our most intimate encounters, can be idolatry. So how did Charlie Rose and Harvey Weinstein and Mac Lauer, and I could go on and on, the whole Me Too rogues gallery, how did they get away with what they got away with? Well, at CBS, Charlie Rose, what he said was truth. He was unquestioned and unquestionable. Harvey Weinstein had super authority. They didn't claim to have superpowers, but they were idols in their industries. If Harvey Weinstein wanted a starlet to get a role, she would get the role. If he wanted her never to work in Hollywood, she wouldn't work in Hollywood. And so they did have and exercise super authority. Now, the way to topple idolatry is in the same way, somewhat like the ancient Israelites did, which is, it was only once there was a massive cry out and some leadership that people could do that. And it took a lot of people, and frankly, lone voices, who were complaining about those folks I mentioned, but nobody listened to them because the idolatry was so strong. And that's why idolatry worries me so much, because it could be a lot of things. It could be communism, and Mao's the God King Pharaoh, or whoever. And it could be on the populist right. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of populist rightists who become God King Pharaohs. So that's why I think the Bible is so relevant today. It's as relevant as it was 3,300 years ago, which is, this is our central problem. And that's what the Bible came to overturn. And that's what we lose today by setting the Bible aside. It's not that the Bible says certain things that are harsh about this, that, or the other. It's about reading the stories and understanding what they're trying to say.
So would that be your biggest criticism of people like Dawkins and Sam Harris, whom I love, by the way? I actually subscribe to I pay for his podcast, but right. I enjoy him because he is excellent intellectual food, but I find him devoid in any sort of spirituality, which I'm okay with, because I understand that when I'm listening to him, it's not for that purpose. But he helps me think about ethics and morality in a way that I might not have otherwise. But yet I find some of his approaches to things just not to kind of be spiritually devoid, I guess, of nourishment. But would you say that your criticism, or their criticism, of religion comes from them mistaking idolatry for what true faith in God is?
Fundamentally, the answer to that question is yes. They set up, and I've read Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris' Letter to a Christian Nation, is waking up, where he tries to get spiritual. Um, and they don't understand what monotheism is, so they set up a straw man. And that straw man is essentially an idolatrous religion. Um, and to a certain degree, that the ironic thing is, in reading those books, is if they really understood monotheism, they could make their criticisms actually in some cases stronger, but they don't even get it. So they make a weaker criticism. I mean, it was sort of, I sort of almost chuckled a few times. So the thing is, though, is that to a certain degree, they replace other things for religion to become idolatrous as well. Scientism. Science explains why, using irrational numbers, we can create this network that's got my Wi-Fi talking to my computer, talking to you sitting in Boise, Idaho, or wherever, from New York, New York. That is science. Science, on the other hand, and Sam Harris tries to explain this, and I've listened to it and I've read it, why science creates morality. And he does it from the absence of pain and this and that. But science doesn't do that. The Nazis thought they were scientists. The Nazis wrote they purported to be the first textbook on medical ethics. It's pretty hard. It's pretty bad. It's evil. But science can get you anywhere depending on what you want to use. Science, unfortunately, is like fire. It can be good. It can be bad. It does not explain the origin of the universe. So when people say, science explains the origin of the universe, they quickly have to pivot to the multiverse, which means, that there's infinite number of universes and we just happen to be on the one universe that happens to be good for life. But it's a faith. Who knows? We've never seen the multiverse. We have no idea if that exists. It's untestable. So that's a faith-based thing. And quickly they go to that, because as I said to you before, the hardest part, believers have to explain good and evil, which is really hard. And I don't want to, and I spend the whole section of the book grappling with that. But explaining that why the universe happens to be, why there's not nothing, science does not offer a very good answer to that. It has a great answer to, once the universe came into being, how we evolved today. It has some good answers to that. And I believe in science. I love science. But saying that science can explain moral things, saying it can explain purpose, saying it can explain how the universe came into being, is just false. And saying it is ascribing to it a super authority that it does not have. And that becomes an idolatry.
Yes, I would agree. And especially we're seeing it with the pandemic and people doubling down on certainty, saying I'm following the science, and it's like, but that's actually not what science is. Science is open-ended knowledge and constantly changing, and yet we're taking this thing that is kind of that search for the knowledge, no meaning, but that search for knowledge, and then we're making claims of certainty that we can't be making. And then anything that doesn't fall within that, then we're being anti-science. It's becoming more dogmatic. And I've expressed this many times on this podcast, that it's become a religion in itself. But you would use in your perspective, the proper word would be idolatry, not religion.
It's ascribing, idolatry. It's ascribing a super authoritative science that it does not have and should, and it's a disservice to science. It's a disservice to call something the science in any event. There is no the science. People have theories. If facts can help negate those theories, there's a new theory, which is great. I mean, that's the power of science. Saying that science has settled things forever. No, there may be, it may be that Newton didn't fully understand the physical universe. Einstein helped create a new paradigm. It may be there's a paradigm today that we just don't understand, and we will in the future.
So when people ask me, for example, what spirituality is, I say it's the search for meaning and then understanding that that meaning comes from something bigger than us.
Yeah.
And so for me, there is not a lot of meaning to be derived from to look through the lens of just science. And one of the people, Yuval Harari.
Yuval Noah Harari.
Yeah, I find him very frustrating because it's either or. It's like there's no possible way for you to look at anything. It's either you look at through the scientific lens, or you look through it through faith or religion or whatever. And of course, he would say, let's look through it the scientific lens, and that anything when we try to ascribe, and he actually gives this example of in Native Americans doing a rain dance to bring rain. And this is where I think it might get interesting between you and I. And, you know, I think it's all great to know the hydrological cycle and how that all works and the science of it. But when Native Americans are doing the rain dance, it is about a relationship to spirit. It's about a relationship to the universe and to nature and all of that. And maybe you would consider all of that idolatry, I'm not sure. But, and there's something meaningful and there's a connection there that's trying to be made. And so they're not doing the rain dance to dismiss science. You can totally understand the water cycle and still, at least in my thinking, do the rain dance, where Yuval Harari would say that it's completely ridiculous for Native Americans to do a rain dance because that's not how the world works and la la la. But for me, it's about that connection and the meaning and the relationship to spirit that makes it has value that is different than understanding the hydrological cycle, but it's still incredibly valuable. So what would you say about all that?
So first of all, I wrote a review of Yuval Harari's book, 21 Lessons. It's on my website. It was published by a major New York magazine. So I have a couple of thousand well-chosen words to say about what he's written. I will say this. Yuval, I think he has an entirely incorrect mindset. He is a great writer. I mean, I wish I could write in a second language as well as I wish I could write in a first language many times as well as he does in a second language. He's great. I mean, he's smart, but he has a particular way of looking at the world, which I think is flawed. And he is the opposite of meaning. I mean, he thinks we're totally here by chance because of certain things that happened on the when we were hunter-gatherers in the agricultural cycle. And I mean, if you read him, I think he really thinks we'd be much happier if we were still in the savannah being hunter-gatherers. And the fact that we ended up today was due to some unfortunate, maybe, or just fortunate or unfortunate happenstances. And there is nothing. Everything is random. He is the opposite of spiritual. Nothing has meaning. Nothing whatsoever in the universe can have meaning. So I don't believe that. I'm not on that path. I think there are two important days. The two most important days for people, for any human being, is the day they're born, because now they have possibility in life. And the second day, and it's just as important, is when they figure out why they're here. What can we do? What can I do on this planet that can make it a little better place, that can help in Jewish terms, litaken olam, b'malchut Shaddai, to fix the tikkun olam. You may have heard that word. You may have heard that sort of Americanized, litaken olam, to make this world a better place. So I believe that the Bible starts that we all have some divine spark. And my job is to find out what my spark is and how to actualize it, and also to recognize you have that spark and that everybody has that spark. And that's in a way the fundamental golden part of the golden rule that I also talk a lot about, which is don't do unto someone else what you wouldn't want it done unto you, because we all share having a different human spark. For me, what prayer is all about is finding that intersection between what God would like me to do and what I can do. Like, I can't invent a new theory of relativity, or something. That's not going to happen. I couldn't possibly do that. But I can do certain other things in the world, and it may be as simple as working in a soup kitchen. It may be as simple as something revolving my family. It may be something involving my workplace. It may be all sorts of things that I can do. And what prayer is about, it's spiritual to me in the sense that it's about moving me to where I need to be, and doing that by trying to connect to a being that is a being that wants all good. I mean, most evil is human evil. Most evil. There's natural disasters and there's disease and sickness. Don't get me wrong. That's huge. But the 75 million people that Mao caused to die didn't have to die. The millions that Hitler caused to die didn't have to die. Pol Pot didn't have to kill 2 million people. And it goes 400,000 Syrians didn't have to die in the last few years because Assad thought it was useful to him. We all have a place and we all can make this world a little better. And to me, that's my spiritual journey. It's not just about me, but it's about how I can make the place better. So for me, meditation can take you so far because it's very inward. But then the next step is, how do I make that outward? And if I do that, if I can connect the inner sense of peace, not peace, but the inner sense of purpose, that's what I mean, with my outward actions, then I think one can get to happiness. It's not easy. And I don't say I'm trying, but it's not easy.
So when you, and I've heard Sam Harris many, many times talk about like specifically Islamic extremism. And so when you see there has been recent examples as well as a lot of historical examples of people using religion as justification for some horrific acts, whether it's slavery or genocide, how does that fit into your conversation about meaning and purpose and having this rational belief in God?
So I don't know how the Baptists count it, but the Catholics and some Protestant denominations count the 10 Commandments. The first one, belief in God. The second one, no false gods. The third, the way at least I know Jews count it, is don't take God's name in vain. And it's the only commandment that continues on. There is no redemption if you do so. There's no redemption if you take God's name in vain. What does that mean? It's not about swearing. I think it's about, because otherwise, why would it need to be in the 10 Commandments? It's about something much more fundamental, which is any time that someone says, I'm the sole spokesperson for God, listen to what I say, what I do is definitionally okay, then that person is weaponizing monotheism. They become a God King Pharaoh. So unfortunately, the person who was the incoming president of Iran he was part of the death committee that shortly after revolution killed between 5 and 30,000 people on a same day basis. Because why? Because the Ayatollah Ayatollah Khomeini was deemed the sole spokesperson for God. So when he said the Baha'is didn't didn't have a right to their religion, it set up a mini genocide in a mini Holocaust, a mini genocide in Iran, because he said so, and definitionally it was okay. So anytime you weaponize religion, and that goes for any monotheistic religion, not just it goes for Islam, it goes for Judaism, it goes for Christianity. Anytime uh, uh, you weaponize um, any organized religion with a sole spokesperson sort of dictating what's good and right, you're in deep trouble. And there is no redemption from that. That's why the third commandment is right behind the other two, or right with the other two that also speak to idolatry. And then it moves on to other topics like not taking false witness, etc.
Well, I have one more question before we transition here. So, coming from Japan, as you know, Shintoism is an interesting religion because it actually has no source material. There's no like Quran or Bible.
Right.
And they have these beautiful, sacred sites, these shrines, and they are dedicated to like the essence of the river or the mountains, or they're called kamis, and they're basically these essences that you would find in the natural world. Now, would you consider that something that's more pantheistic? They're not necessarily gods, but their essence. Would you consider that idolatry? Like, how do you fit in some of these Eastern religions into this? Because none of them are monotheistic. How would you
Well,
look at those?
it's a complicated question that can't be oversimplified, because I think Hinduism is very different than Shintoism. Buddhism is
True.
clearly very different than Shintoism. And I think there are overlaps. I mean, there is a Hindu in the Upanishads, I'm probably mispronouncing that talks about someone going, a master going, or a student going to a his master and asking how many gods there are. And first he says one number, then he says the number he said, then he comes back and he says, but in reality, one. There's a whole bunch of different traditions. Buddhism is very complicated, but when I was in Japan, I was very thankful that the Buddhists had many restaurants so I could eat vegetarian and be happy with that. But Shintoism is different. I went to the Meiji Shrine when I was in Tokyo, and I decided, for research for the book, as they say, and although I enjoyed going and seeing it very much, but I was there and I sat in on a service. I was sat in the back in the corner, and when the service was over, I sort of figured out what some of it was, but it was a company that had come in for a blessing, to have the gods bless this company's activity, and I just happened to pick it. I mean, I would have said in another service, I clearly didn't know what was going on, or what the names of the things were. And I said to one of the priests there, I said, well, is this company doing good? Is this company doing good things, bad things? In the past, did they do good things? Did they plan to do good things? That was irrelevant. They had contracted for this blessing. I guess they had, and I don't mean this as any criticism. I mean this, I'm reporting at this point. But they had just contracted for it. They had paid money. This company wanted a blessing. They clearly believed in the value of the blessing. But it had nothing to do with fixing the world, making it a better place. It had nothing to do with righteousness. It had to do with a little bit viewing their gods as a cosmic vending machine. If we make the right dances, gestures, music, with the music and the gestures were incredible, they were captivating, then we should get the proper outcome. There was no juxtaposition with righteousness and goodness. And that's a danger of all idolatries. And Shintoism is, to a certain degree, is essentially an idolatry. I mean, the emperor was a avatar of the gods, and clearly that created all sorts of problems in the regime leading up to World War II. So, complicated answer. I didn't even do it full justice.
I kind of wish I would have picked Buddhism because you're right. Shintoism is sort of an outlier. But anyway, there's just actually so many more things I could ask you about. But I'm actually quite interested about your upcoming book, Conspiracy U, a case study, because this is actually something that is, I would consider myself left of center, but I'm an independent. But I've seen, especially in the era of Trump, really people doubling down on the far right, far left ideologies. And we're seeing a lot of that coming up through the university. So I find that that's going to be a very interesting book. I'd like for you to just speak on that for a moment.
Sure. So I was sort of stunned when I started doing the research on Conspiracy U. It started out as a 2,500 word essay that I was writing on to commemorate my father's 75th anniversary of the liberation of Dachau. And I started to write it, and it was a really amazing. As I did the research, I found that there are some far right professors. I mean, I talk about one, he's a Holocaust denier. And yes, he's a Holocaust denier, but at heart, he is an anti-Zionist and sort of hates Jews. Not sort of, but more than sort of. And on the left, as I started to read what they were writing, particularly about Zionism and about other theories that they had created, that there are folks at universities who are creating theories that negate facts. It's sort of like idolatry, which is why it resonated to me. Like they would set aside facts and create what were essentially conspiracy theories. In many cases, in some cases about Jews, in some cases, things you could never write down on paper. You could never have it published by Duke University Press or Stanford Press unless the topic was somehow Jews. And it was breathtaking to learn, that the word campus rabbi would be used in this as a sinister term in a book written by tenured professors. And this, as I started to go deeper, and this is, I think, what is the sort of novel part of the book, is I compare the far right professors and the far left professors. And when you dig deep enough, they're saying the same thing. And they're both touting conspiracy theories that are untethered to facts. And that's really scary for the United States of America, because one thing I learned from my teacher, from someone I had the privilege of learning from, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, is that what begins with the Jews never ends with the Jews. It didn't happen that way in Europe, and it generally, Jews are frequently the canary in the coal mine. And this is really, really dangerous stuff. And so I'm hoping that my book, Conspiracy U, resonates. It's actually just was posted for pre-order on Amazon. It's actually going to come out in a few months, but it's available for pre-order now. So I'm hoping it makes an impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, I could have spoke to you on many more things and fleshed out a lot more threads that we pulled on a lot more threads there. But I want to give you an opportunity to share your website, social media, any way that my listeners can connect with you.
Sure. Thank you. So I have a website called scottshay.com, SHAY, and 2 T's in Scott. And there you can, I post things that I write about religion. I just posted an article, Friending Job, about social media and the book of Job. And I write about economics as well. And you can get my books. You can get my books anywhere. They're on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, quality bookstores anywhere that are still open, unfortunately. There aren't too many. But, and I can be reached on that website as well.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. I'd love to have you back when your book comes out in October, I think.
Yes, it'd be a pleasure.
All right. Wonderful. When we will be back after this ridiculously short break. Are you enjoying this podcast and want to help this lady out? Well, share it with friends, or even better, leave a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to the show. Well, that's it for today's episode. Coming up on our next episode of Chaos and Light, we have Casey Ari, and we talk about dismantling illusions and really have an in-depth discussion about our multidimensionality, about judgment, really a fantastic conversation about all things spiritual. Well, that's it. Take care and seek the mystery.